It is largely well known and believed that modern-day birds evolved from prehistoric dinosaurs. And much like any other good product, Spyderco had to evolve their Byrd line of knives in order to stay competitive in the modern day and age of budget knives. And that's what we're looking at today. We are looking at the evolution of the very first Byrd knife ever created, the BY01 Harrier. Now, it's actually really interesting to do this review because the modern day Harrier, this one is the G10 version. I don't have the FRN version, simply because I'm not a huge fan of Byrd's FRN. I find it to be a little cheap feeling and often not radiused, though I will say the lightweight version of the Harrier 2 does look like they've radiused the FRN more. Even still, I prefer the G10 version. But this is, carrying the name of the Harrier, but it shares very little in common with that original design, which is a very rare, very famous, in the Spyderco collecting world anyways, production blade. Essentially it, along with the smaller version of it, the Sparrowhawk BY02, were Spyderco's first attempt at producing knives in China to compete in the budget market. And they wanted to create the best Chinese budget knives that could be made. They were on a mission to create knives that proved that you can make a quality knife even in China. And it was a very unsuccessful first attempt. From what I understand, about 1,000 of each knife, the Harrier and Sparrowhawk, were made, and most of each were destroyed due to not meeting quality standards. And so they are incredibly rare, incredibly collectible, and incredibly valuable. And they looked nothing like this. They were a very different blade design with a combination micarta and stainless steel bolster handle, and a Persian swept blade made out of a US 6 steel. And they are ungodly rare. So I want you all to appreciate the fact that I tracked down and bought one for no other reason than the review of these knives. And because I collect Byrd knives, admittedly. But you can see there, BY01 BMP Byrd. And in here is the first generation Byrd Harrier. The rarest, along with the BY02 Sparrowhawk, Byrd knife to exist. And I put out a good amount of money to get this knife for you guys. Embarrassed to say, I spent $230 simply so I could make this review as thorough and historically informative as possible. And again, because I collect the Byrd knives. It's kind of a secondary collection for me, but it facilitated that as well. But you can really see, comparing these knives side by side, they share very, very little in common. The handles are different, the position of the lockback is different, the blades are completely different. So why did Spyderco call this the Harrier 2? Two simple reasons. For one, they wanted to harken back to the first production model because it makes for a good write-up in advertising. And for two, the model already existed in a general size that filled a role the Byrd line didn't currently fill. As you know, the Robin is basically a budget Dragonfly, the Delica, or the Metallark is a budget Delica, the Caracara is a budget Endura, but they didn't have a budget Indela, but the Harrier would be the right size for that. So here we have the Harrier 2, an in-between of the Metallark and the Caracara, meant to be a budget representative of the Indela, the middle ground between the Delica and the Endura. So yeah, it was mostly marketing. Let's go ahead and have a look at packaging. You already saw the Byrd Harrier 1's packaging, very generic white box. If we open it up, there's a little bit of paperwork inside. You can see Byrd limited warranty. You have a warranty for 30 days. How cool. Not exactly what I'd call a good warranty, but they were trying things out. And this is not actually the box for the Harrier 2, but the Byrd knives of today all have the exact same box. This is actually my box for the Metallark 2, lightweight. But it shows you what you're going to get. It's basically just a green version of the Spyderco packaging. I actually really like the boxes on the Byrd knives. Here's what you all care about, though. The knives themselves. And this is really a 2-for-1 review because these are wildly different knives that share a namesake. They share a general overall size as well, slight difference on handle length, but they are both really cool knives in their own right, very attractive knives in their own right. However, I want to say that if you're in the market for this to use it, I would look elsewhere. There is definitely some problems with the knife, and Yeah. So let's talk about it. The blade on the Generation 1 is made of AUS6, as you can see, and it's produced in China. It actually shows you the exact city in China. That's cool. I actually wish that more companies would do that. I think it's nice to give some recognition. We see Seki City, Japan, and Solingen, Germany, and all sorts of stuff like that on knives made in those countries. So I like seeing the exact Chinese city that this was produced in. And, sorry, talking about the blade still. So it's AUS6. It's a Persian-style blade with a hollow grind starting about 5/8 of the way down. Kind of a saber grind, really, more than anything. And this is the out-of-box edge. I have not used this for very obvious reasons. It's an extremely expensive, extremely collectible knife. So let me go ahead and get a piece of paper to do a cut test with. Here's the edge out-of-box. It's okay. You can see it's not the cleanest cuts. Definitely not a razor's edge. Just for comparison, here's the Harrier. Here's the Harrier 2, and I have used this, but even after use, a much better edge on that knife. Haven't sharpened it, just used it. So the blade is not the best edge out of box, and you can see it's a very, very steep relief edge on that, and not evenly ground. It's shallower on one side versus the other, which speaks to some of that low quality I was talking about. 3.4 inches long for both of them, by the way, so right in that middle ground between the Metallark and the Caracara that would come later. Now let's go ahead and look at the Harrier 2. It is a more leaf-shaped drop point design, full flat ground, made of what we all know from Byrd, 8CR 13 MOV. On the back side, we have China, and you can see this blade is ground much better, and obviously wears a much better edge. This one was an advertisement for Roswell Tire and Appliance. I don't really care about that. It was just the cheapest deal I got on eBay, so there you go. Very different blade shapes, grinds, and steels. 8CR 13 MOV is kind of the reference standard for budget knives, or at least it was. D2's kind of taken its spot these days, but it holds a decent edge. It sharpens extremely quickly, takes a beautifully fine edge, is not super rust resistant, but decent enough if you keep the blade wiped down. More than adequate for EDC. AUS6, I also feel is actually adequate for EDC. I don't think the average person's using their knife for that much cutting. AUS6 is a Japanese equivalent to 440A, for anyone who's not familiar. Also could be considered the Japanese version of 7CR 17 MOV, which notably this is not. Even though it is made in China, Spyderco was very clear in their write-up back in the day that they imported the steel from Japan. So it is real Japanese AUS6. It won't hold a super great edge for very long, but long enough for EDC. Pretty good rust resistance, sharpens incredibly readily, and takes a beautiful razor's edge. I think either steel is good enough for EDC. Slicing, I don't think this saber grind is going to make her a great slicer, especially with it not being super even on that relief edge. That said, this leaf drop point blade, full flat grind, slices like a laser. It's a fairly thin stock, which also helps to facilitate the slice. The tip is very fine and penetrative and easily punctures through clamshells and bubble mailers and all the stuff I usually say. Versus the Persian knife, the tip is much thicker, still very pointy though. It would still function just fine if you were crazy enough to use this knife as an EDC blade. Let's talk about deployment and lockup, because it is another example of some of the issues that they had with the Harrier 1. So they deploy via the Comet hole. You can see on the Generation 2, they've made the Comet hole less extreme. They've done this across all of the Byrd knives from Generation 1 to Generation 2. I actually thought that this had more character and personality on the shape. This works just fine. They both function identically to a spider hole, and the deployment is fast on the Harrier 2. It's not great on the Harrier 1. I kind of have to have a little wrist pop, and it's not the smoothest action in the world. On the Harrier 2, it's very smooth action. Comes out extremely readily. Can I spider flick it? Not super easily. The lockback is pretty tight, but I can get it sometimes. Definitely can't spider flick the Harrier 2 without or the Harrier 1 without considerable wrist action. So it's not a super fast knife. They are both lockbacks. You can see the placement of the lockback. It's more mid-placed on the 1, higher placed on the 2. and they both have the David Boy detent for easier depression of that lockback. The Harrier 1 has play side to side and a little bit up and down, and you cannot adjust it. It is riveted. Okay, you can see that it is a riveted pin. On the Harrier 2, I can flex that lock bar for up and down play. Same thing here. I have to really rock it to flex the lock bar, but I can flex that lock bar side to side. It's tight, and we can adjust it at the pivot point if we ever need to. So the lockup on the Generation 1 is not very good and not very adjustable. On the Generation 2, it's quite good. I know some folks will say, well, if you could flex that lock bar, it's not worth a damn. Go watch my Cold Steel AK-47 review. I could flex the lock bar on some of those triad locks. It's a very common problem in the lockback design. If you rock it hard enough, you can feel some give. It is what it is. So on the Generation 1, it's not super great. And think about this. This is one of the ones that passed the quality inspection. Imagine how bad the ones that didn't were. But on the Generation 2, the one you're actually going to be able to find, it's quite serviceable. We do have some jimping top side and bottom side of the knife here on the finger choil that you can lock into really well, and the jimping is very purposeful. The Generation 1, no jimping to speak of, but we do have a good thumb ramp. And I will say the Generation 1 is super ergonomic. I mean, the Gen 2 is comfy, make no mistake. It's very thin. They've rounded and radiused the corners of that G10 beautifully. This is a comfortable knife in hand, but the ergonomics on the Generation 1 were supreme. Absolutely love to see it. Materials, obviously very different. On the Generation 1, it was micarta with stainless steel bolsters, and it is a beautiful micarta. I love this. I think it's very attractive. I like the bolsters. It gives a very classy look. Generation 2, again, your choice of FR9 or G10. I went G10. It's fairly slick G10. It started out more tractionable, but as time went on, it wore down and is now fairly slick. I'd say medium traction overall before you wear it down, though. I didn't mention we are riding on phosphor bronze washers in the pivot point for the Generation 2. For the Generation 1, can't really see down there. I'd hazard a guess of Teflon, just given the age of the knife. I think that's a good thing on a hard use or medium hard use lockback. Any knife you're going to put into a lot of cutting, I like washers over ball bearings because it's easier to clean the pivot point out. They're not as susceptible to grit, and I don't know. I've always found washers to be a better hard use pivot system over ball bearings, so they have their place in case anyone cares. Handle length is 4.3 inches on the Generation 2, 4.5 on the Generation 1, so slightly longer handle for the original model, and you can see a very different overall handle design. They really did just name this the Harrier because it was roughly the same size and it was good for marketing. Let's talk weight. I'll bring in my scale, as I love to do, and we'll weigh both the Generation 1 and the Generation 2 side by side. So the Byrd Harrier 1 is a hefty 5.5 ounces. The Generation 2 is a lofty 3.4, essentially. Very carryable, especially given the size of the blade. I think that's actually a pretty good weight considering how long the blade is. Again, 3.4 inches long. And it's a G10 handle. A lot of that is down to how thin the handle is and the fact that the stainless steel liners are only half liners and they are inset into the G10 handles. Love to see it. I think all the Byrd lines should be reimagined for a Generation 3 with this system. On the Generation 1, we obviously have full stainless steel liners that are not milled in any shape, way, or form, and that adds to the weight. Talking about pocket clips, huge improvement on the Generation 2. I'll bring in the cutlery lever pocket here just for so I have it here on hand. Generation 1 is fixed with 3 Phillips head screws, and it carries quite high, a lot exposed from the pocket. That said, it doesn't flare up towards the tip, and the tension is perfect. So let's show how this carries. Quite a bit of knife exposed from the pocket. The Generation 2 is affixed with 3 T6 torque screws and is a traditional Spyderco spoon clip. The same thing you'll see on the Enduras, Delicas, Caracaras, Metalarks. Doesn't flare up too much towards the tip, has good tension, and can be put on any of the 4 corners of the knife. By comparison, here's how this knife carries in the pocket. So it's actually about the same amount of knife exposed from the pocket either way. It just looks like more is exposed, or would be exposed here when you put the knives side by side. But in actual carry, it's about the same. So I guess I can't fault the Harrier too much for that. I can fault it for this, though. The overall price. Because it's such a rare and collectible knife, they are not easy to find. And Spyderco collectors are among the most ravenous out there. And the die-hard ones will even collect Byrd knives. I personally am trying to collect every single Byrd knife, but there are people who are much more hardcore than me. And as a result, yeah, I paid $230, I believe, for this knife. And it's the only one I could find a sold reference for. So I don't even know if I got a good deal or if they're going to go higher than that. The Generation 2 is, in my opinion, overpriced. Looking at $35 for the lightweight, $55 for the G10. I like this knife a lot. It's very comfortable in the hand. It's a very good performing blade. Great shape, great grind, decent steel. But we can get much better materials for $55 today. And that's kind of a problem I have with the Byrd line, one of many. I'll make a video about where I think Spyderco went wrong with this line. But $55 to $55 is expensive for this. You can score them used for less, but I mean, HCR 13 MOV at $55 is rough because we can get D2, VG10, in some cases even 154 CM and ATS 34. We can get Nitro V, 14C28N. We can get so many better steels at this price point that it can be really, really rough to pay $50 for an HCR 13 MOV blade in this day and age. All of that said, I am a big fan of collecting the Byrd knives. I think they're very interesting and cool. They're not the Harrier 2 isn't the best value on the market, but if you're looking for a beater version of the Andella that you won't feel bad about if you break it or lose it or whatever, it's definitely got its place. It's not the greatest value out there, but it is a good knife and it is still reasonably affordable. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.